I'm going to put my sermon notes away because I've tried all week to make this sermon work, and these just confuse me more. So I'll just put them away. I don't know who said this or who wrote this, but I ran across a quote this week that I just fell in love with. I read it. The church is like a football huddle. Everybody knows that something important's being said, though almost nobody understands what it is. And you can always see the rear ends. Think about the depth of that. Maybe the reason people have trouble understanding what it is that we're talking about, what it is that we're trying to say, is because we're dealing with, well, pretty hard stuff. We're trying to talk about the one who is behind all things, in all things, the one who has created us and lives within us and stands by us. And so we struggle to find the right symbol. And so in the English language, we have come up with a 3-letter word called God. And that's not something that can be dealt with in simplistic terms. Because once you think you've defined God, as I said about Anselm's understanding of understanding, once you think that you understand God, you should assume that you probably are clueless. So when we talk about this terminology, it's hard stuff, talking about God. And yet, what today's text says is that there were those who had gathered together, and Luke goes out of the way to say that there were these Jews who spoke many different languages. We know they spoke Hebrew. More likely, those who were from the Middle East spoke in Aramaic, a kind of a form of Hebrew. There were those, however, that maybe had a little bit of Latin, having been ruled by the Romans, and those who certainly knew Greek and many other languages. And they had gathered together. And suddenly, Luke says to us, the Spirit of God, pneuma. We first run into the Spirit of God in Genesis, ruach. Both cases, it's about the breath of God. Both cases feminine, by the way, in case anybody's wondering. And the breath of God comes amongst these people. Now here's the interesting thing. People who may have had trouble understanding this whole thing of God suddenly received the gift of understanding each other. Now you can't, for those of you seeing this, says, oh, well, that's a neat miracle. No, you don't get that. I have spent decades of my life sitting in board meetings in no telling how many different churches, and we have spoken the same language and still have trouble coming away understanding each other. These people received the gift of understanding each other. The power of the blowing of God's mighty wind stirring things up. Well, what did those observing have to say? Well, they're drunk. Remember, early in Luke's first book, the Gospel, when Jesus comes forth, one of the accusations was, well, Jesus is because of people he associated with, well, Jesus is a glutton and a winebibber. So we come into Acts, the sequel of Luke, and say, oh, well, they're drunk. They're drunk. It's at that point that Peter steps forward and begins to preach. Another thing to scratch our heads about. Let's go back to Luke, the Gospel. Where do we find Peter toward the end of Luke? Let's see. It was on a Thursday evening. They're sitting in a room. There's a solemn feel about it all. And in that moment, Jesus identifies that someone at table would betray, that someone would deny. And Peter, in his impetuous way, I always like Grady Nutt saying, that Peter always played Barney Fife to Andy Taylor's Jesus. Veins sticking out of his neck, I can see it now. And he jumps up and he's beyond himself, says, no matter what you think, I can be counted on. I will be there. No matter what happens in the future, I will never leave you. I will always be behind you. And then the soldiers come to take Jesus away, and Peter is indeed behind Jesus, but he's so far behind nobody can actually see him. And then in the morning hours, he's confronted by a young maid. Oh, yeah, you were with that man Jesus. And Peter, always bold Peter, says, what are you talking about? No, I'm sure. You were there. No, it wasn't me. And finally, another confrontation. Oh, yes, you were there. And at that point, Peter curses and says, I never knew this man. That's the Peter we're talking about. And now, the wind has blown, and Peter somehow has been transformed. And out here in the public place, Peter steps forward and begins to preach. If we simply take the words that Luke puts into Peter's mouth, sermon was about 3 minutes. Some of us who do this week in and week out, we probably should take a lesson from that. 3 minutes or so, and it says that thousands wanted to be baptized. There was a power in Peter that prior to that time seemed to be missing. Oh, yes, there was a tempestuous Peter. There was a mouthy Peter. There was a one who always wanted to be out front about everything, but suddenly Peter is transformed. And Peter no longer stutters in talking about the living God. Power of Pentecost can do that. It's hard talking about this God stuff. I get paid to do it, and sometimes, as I just folded my cards and put in my pocket, I'm still not comfortable doing it. I have seen through the years people who were incredibly eloquent, who had positions of power, people who were counted upon to speak publicly, and when you ask them to read the scripture on Sunday morning, I've stood behind the pulpits and watched as their hands trembled and their voices get shaky and their knees keep trying to knock together, and I pray, please don't let the knees miss or they may go down. And they can hardly find their voice. Why? Because it's this God stuff. Holy stuff. Trying to utter about a mystery that we can never fully understand. I've often asked people in churches where I've served, so, have you shared with any of your neighbors your faith? And let me say that in all my years of ministry, I seldom have had hands raised. Ooh. Now you're getting messy, preacher. Well, people don't want to bother religion. People would think I was strange. People would think this or that and the other. But I got to say this about many of you here at Cocoa Beach Community Church. And I don't know why you're so strange, but I've watched many of you stand up publicly and are willing to say, I have found joy and acceptance and an inclusive love in this community, and we would like for you to come and find out. What is it about you people anyway? You're not Bible belters by heart. Some of you are Yankees. And yet I have found your willingness to say, with that spirit of good news, something is happening here. There is a wind a blowing, And I can't explain it, but it has a wonder to it all. I watched a few weeks ago at Fiesta Brevard. We all were having a good time. Some were a couple of booths down at the margarita stand. They were having a really good time. But we were all having a good time. You know, and people were trying to figure out how many beads I was wearing, and they were signing up for raffles, and it was really a great mixture of stuff. But I watched with wonder as people really were sharing the good news about this place, this community. And I wanted to step up and say, well, look, these people are not perfect. I hope you're not buying this line. But then I knew that what they were speaking was truth. That the Spirit does move. People do encounter the mystery. People are open to something that cannot easily be described. It's called the good news. And the Spirit blows where it will, the Scriptures say, and when it does, there is a power that changes things, that changes people, even people like Peter, and just maybe someone like you. Don't get worried, they're never going to elect you as the Pope. That was only like a Peter thing, supposedly. But it changes us. A friend of mine who came up and did some hiking with me on study leave, we talked about this and the problem of mainline people finding a voice, counteracting some of the more negative language that comes out on behalf of God from other places. And so I said to him, I don't know. I can't figure this out. I always hated in church when people use business language. It drives me crazy. Because there's something so utterly different than the pragmatism of the business community. But I said to him, it's almost as if folk at Cocoa Beach Community Church have found a product. And I don't mean that in the worst kind of way. I mean that in the good kind of way. A product that blesses and brings joy. And because of that, they don't mind saying what is true for them. Are you called to preach? For your sake, I hope not. But are you called to preach? And as I read the book of Acts, every one of you are. And some of you do it incredibly well. The way you love, the way you minister, the way you care, the way you manifest within your bodies the good news. Thanks be to God for your ministry because of Pentecost, because of the living one. And may we never, ever lose the desire and joy to let others know who are longing for community and love and inclusion. Yeah, it's just coming out all over the place. You're definitely called to preach.